All right, welcome. If you are watching this screencast, it's probably because you missed this session or you just wanted to catch up on how targeting works in the API. Today we'll be doing a little bit of talking about custom presets and saving targeting expressions through the DFP API. My name's Nicholas Chen. I'm a developer programs engineer on DFP. Also in this presentation will be my colleague Chris Seeley, who we call MCC Seeley over at Google. So if you watched the earlier presentation that Chris gave, you created a video line item. You set content metadata key hierarchy targeting on there, and you made that point to all of basketball NCAA. Basically, we want to target the entirety of March Madness. But now what can you do with that? Let's say you have a scenario in which one of your favorite teams lost in the tournament. You no longer want to target that team on your line item. We're going to be doing a little bit of discussion on how you might do that and how you might do that in a more scalable manner. We'll talk about custom targeting, how to serialize your custom targeting. Basically, if you wanted to save a targeting expression as a preset, how you might do that. And we'll have a little bit of a demo, basically an app that I wrote on how you might serialize this in a UI, and how you might save that serialized data into a database. So if we hop on over, I'm going to give you a slight preview of this app that I wrote. Just to give you a little bit of context, something that comes up a lot is we have third parties and we have publishers often asking us how they can have targeting expressions saved through the API. There's use cases in which you might have traffickers who you don't want altering the targeting expressions directly, and you want to set them up beforehand. Or maybe you're a publisher who wants to save these expressions so your third-party integration can just apply them to line items. We put together a small UI in which at the bottom, you'll see that I've synced down the custom targeting, the custom keys and values in your network. If you're curious about how I did this, we'll be uploading the code for the application, and you'll be able to see that directly. But basically, I have my key show with the value, heavenly hell. And then I have geo-targeting, which I've synced down from the geo-target table, your ad unit targeting, and the content metadata key hierarchies, which is something that we're going to be working with a little bit later. Up here, we have a open text field in which you have just basically a dictionary of targeting values. This is more or less what we're going to go over today, how to construct this tree. But this text box will allow you to save whatever targeting expression you've built, and you'll be able to reuse that later on. So just a slight sneak peek at what we're going to be working with today. So it's more or less what I just explained, but here's a little bit of a diagram outlining what our application looks like. On the far left, you'll have the DFP server. This is what our API clients are going to interface with, and what your traffickers and your publishers are very intimately familiar with on a day-to-day basis. Our application has a backend, which in our case is built on NDB because we're using App Engine. We're going to sync down the targeting information, as I mentioned, and in that, we're going to read the saved targeting info that we've synced down and render it in the UI. So that was the list of ad units that you saw, the list of keys and values that you saw, and the list of content metadata key hierarchies that you saw. And on the far right, you'll notice that I also mentioned that there's a text field for you to enter your saved targeting expression. Once you've entered it, we'll make it possible for you to write this back to the DB as a new object that we'll be creating. And from there, you'll have endpoints exposed through the application so that you can apply these to line items from any of a number of consumers. All of this to come, just a sneak preview of what you might be looking forward to. So, custom targeting. Custom targeting is hard. The UI has a visual representation of what custom targeting and targeting in general looks like. The API doesn't. In the UI, you have a nice little targeting picker that lays out your custom targeting keys and values, helps you set up your and/or operators, has all the geo-targets nested in a logical manner. You have your countries at the top and cities within that. The API is just a bunch of values and IDs. I understand. It's hard to work with when you just see numbers. On top of that, networks have tons of custom targeting values. They also have tens of thousands of geo-targeting values. The sheer volume of possible IDs that you're setting on these targeting expressions can often make it a bit of a headache to work with. And this isn't even to mention, for custom criteria specifically, that you have freeform and predefined keys and values. All of these things added together make it really hard to keep things in sync and up to date. But I promise you, it can be made easier. So, how might you go about accomplishing this? One way is if you had a targeting expression builder. This is a direct quote that we got through our email alias. Someone actually mentioned that building targeting expressions in the API is confusing. Can I reuse the in-product targeting builder in my application? They wanted to more or less drop in the targeting picker in an iframe into their app. And that would be awesome, but you can't do that. A better answer is you can probably do something similar. You just have to take a little bit of time and infrastructure and invest towards building out your own targeting expression system, similar in functionality to ours, or maybe even catered to your publisher or your systems. So the first thing I did want to talk about is the targeting objects in the API and their underlying structure. It's often hard just working with a bunch of generic objects, so hopefully this can demystify some of the required fields and IDs and how to construct them in the API. There's a link to the docs, so if you're curious and taking a deeper dive into any of these, feel free to look at our developer page on developers.google.com. The list of available targeting on line items is currently geo-targeting. All those cities and countries that you want to serve specifically to, you would find them under that object. We offer the granularity down to things like airports and prefectures, so there really isn't much you can't target. We have inventory targeting, the one required targeting field on line items. This would be the ad units or placements that you want to segment your inventory by. You have daypart targeting. Maybe you only want to serve an ad on weekends, or maybe you only want to serve it during commuting hours on weekdays. This is where you would set that kind of stuff. You have technology targeting, which if you were with us in our last developer workshop, we showed you how to target just Android mobile devices. And this is where you'd set browser, OS, things that are specific to, as you guessed it, technology. Next is custom targeting. This deals with custom criteria and is probably one of the most oft asked questions. Keys and values, like I said, there's a lot of them, and working with them in the expression trees is hard. So we'll be taking a deeper dive into that one. User domain targeting is the .com, .net, .org type targeting that you want. If you only want to serve to students, you might just use .edu targeting. For content, this is where you do your video-specific targeting. For what we're doing today, we'll be taking a deeper dive and looking at content metadata key hierarchy, which is something that Chris touched on in the earlier session. We'll be showing you how to update that. Lastly is video position targeting. This is specific to where in a video stream you want to serve your video ad. Maybe you want to serve it as a pre-roll, maybe you don't want to serve more than once in your entire video. This is where you set that kind of stuff. So to start, let's talk about geo-targeting. It contains two fields, targeted locations and excluded locations. Each field is specified by a list of location objects. Really, when you're working with geo-targeting, the only thing you need to specify is the ID. You'll get these IDs from the Publisher Query Language Service if you use the geo-target table. There's specifically a column that says targetable. If you look at targetable equals true, those are the ones that DFP supports. And like I said, the targetable, types ranges from countries all the way down to airports. So pretty much as much granularity as you need, you can get. Next, we'll move on to custom targeting. These deal with custom criteria, keys, and values. Custom targeting objects contain custom criteria set objects, and they can have up to 3 levels of targeting. The top level can only be an ORed together set of conditions. Logically, this is so you can construct any nested and or statement. You'll see on the diagram on the right, the top level custom criteria set is an or. This is more or less what the UI does, so we're mimicking that same structure in the API. Within that, you'd have 2 fields, the logical operator and the children. The logical operator is either or, and the children can either be a custom criteria set to continue on this nested structure, or it could be a custom criteria leaf node, which is the end of the structure. And this would just be a custom criteria key and a list of values that you either want to target or exclude. Both of these are required. Next, we have content targeting, which, as we mentioned earlier, deals specifically with video. This includes a whole list of various types of content that you can target or exclude, but we're moving towards using content metadata. As most of your video content is ingested via a stream now, the process to target videos should really be done automatically. You have a bunch of metadata that's set on these videos that tell you what type of videos they are. So the two that we actually care about the most today are targeted content metadata and excluded content metadata. And these are set with a list of content metadata key hierarchy objects. I'll give you a second to digest all those words, but within that, you would only need to specify the custom targeting value IDs. These are the value IDs that correlate to the keys belonging to a content metadata key hierarchy. If you need more insight on this, definitely take a peek at our developer docs. I'm sure they will help a lot in demystifying this object. So, how do you construct these objects? I'm going to show you how to do this in a weakly type language first. This would be specific to Python, or it would also work in Ruby and PHP. For those Java and .NET developers out there, fret not. My colleague Chris will be going over how you might do this in Java in just a little bit, so hang tight and just take in the gist of what we're constructing here. So starting with the targeting object, you'll notice that it looks more or less like a traditional dictionary, because that's all it really is. At the top level, you have your targeting object. This is nested as a key within your line item. For the first one that I wanted to talk about, we'll be creating the geo-targeting objects, which, as I mentioned, has a targeted locations list and an excluded locations list. Again, the objects within these two fields are a list of location objects. Notice I don't specify anything but the ID because that's all that's required. You would get these values from the P-equal table called geotarget. So, continuing on, we construct that same targeting object, but now we're going to touch on custom targeting. This is, like I mentioned, probably one of the most asked aspects of targeting because it's nested, it's confusing, and these expressions can get out of hand. The first thing you have to do, because it's not as straightforward as specifying a list of IDs, is you have to tell it what kind of object is at every level. You'll remember that I had custom criteria sets as well as custom criteria nodes, which are leaves, and that these can cascade down up to 3 levels. So I have to set the XSI type. In this case, the top level must be a custom criteria set. And as I mentioned, the logical operator for the first level has to be an OR. Even if you only have one key and one value, you have to OR them together. It's just what the UI does, so that's what we're mimicking in the API. After that, we specify the children that we're operating that logical operator on. In this case, we want to finish our tree expression, so we're saying the nested object is a custom criteria object, of which you have the key ID, which is the custom targeting key ID, which you'd find in your inventory targeting tab in the UI or your custom targeting service in the API. And then you'd have a list of value IDs. These are the values that correspond to that key. And then you'd have an operator that tells you whether it is or is not targeting that key and that value. So we can finish up and close up this expression. This can go on and on and on, but only for 3 levels. So realistically, when you boil it down to how to construct these objects, it's more or less just nesting custom criteria or custom criteria set objects within the children field, and it's really not as bad as it looks. So on to content targeting, the star of today's show. There's 2 things that we want to focus on, and that's the fact that you can target content metadata. These are the content metadata key hierarchies that you want to target, and you can exclude them, which has the same setup as above. And you'll notice that for each of the value IDs, I'd pass in a list of value IDs that correspond to the keys. In an example that I like to give for content metadata key hierarchies, you might have video content that's being ingested. The top level might be a key that calls something like genre, which has a value of comedy. You might have a show name as the second level key, which might have a value of friends, and you might have a final key, the third level of the hierarchy, that's called season, and it might be season 10, which is indisputably the best. So now that we've gone over how to construct all of these in a generic dictionary sense, I haven't forgotten about you Java developers. My colleague Chris will describe how you might create these objects via Java.
Thanks, Nick. So looking at this, it's pretty similar to the examples that Nick was showing. It's just a little more verbose because it's Java and you don't have that straight text dictionary. And the example we're going to be looking at is the same content metadata key hierarchy targeting that Nick was just pointing out. And you see that we just use strongly typed classes here. We create a new content metadata key hierarchy targeting object, and we set the value IDs. We set the targeted value IDs. And you can see on the overarching content targeting, that's where we set the targeted content metadata, which is the object we just created. And then that rolls up onto the top level targeting object, and we set it there as well. So same thing as the big dictionary that Nick was showing you, but just a little more verbose and explicit in the strongly typed languages.
Thanks, Chris. So you're asking yourself, how might this work? We've just explained how to construct these objects, and you could probably whiteboard the hell out of them if we asked you in an interview. But it's not very useful until you put it into practice. So the UI that I had showed you earlier is available at dfptargetingpresets.appspot.com/showtargeting. We've exposed this on App Engine. And as a corollary to that, what happens when you've saved those targeting expressions? We've actually exposed RESTful endpoints on that so that you can expose them to a client. So going back to our application, let's say we wanted to construct a new targeting preset. Like I said, maybe your favorite team lost in March Madness, and let's say, for instance, that it's Duke. I know, it's a huge upset. Maybe we want to call this March Madness No Duke. So let's go through each of the objects and construct our targeting object. The first one is content targeting. This is the metadata key hierarchy that we want to exclude. You'll notice that I have my targeted content metadata list. So within that, I have the objects for the content metadata key hierarchies I want to target. Now we have to find the value IDs correlating to it. I have a little bit of a search filter here. So we remember that the first key to that hierarchy is called sports. So we still care about basketball. So we're going to go ahead and paste that into the targeted value ID here. And then the second level of our content metadata key hierarchy is league. Now, league. All right. So under league, we only care about the NCAA. It's March Madness after all. We don't want to target this towards the NBA. And the last thing that we want to look at is the teams. So here's the value for Duke. But remember, we don't want to serve to Duke. So what we really want to do is to change this to excluded content metadata. And in addition, because we don't want to blow away the existing targeting we have on the line item, we might call this targeted content metadata and simply leave off Duke from that metadata key hierarchy. Now, the next object, which is absolutely required, is inventory targeting. Right now, we have 2 targeted ad units, but for the sake of our workshop, we only really want to target the Developer Day March 2015 ad unit. So we can go ahead, strip out the ad unit ID, delete our second redundant entry, and then move on to geo-targeting. So I've included the excluded and targeted locations with their list of location objects, but For what we care about today, we can probably delete most of this. I just included this so it's a little bit easier to read. I'm going to go ahead and say that I'm deleting the location to target as Geneva, but I will leave the US. It's March Madness after all, and it's NCAA, so we probably want to target the US. And we can probably just go ahead and delete excluded locations. So here's our completed targeting expression. We have our content targeting our NCAA basketball metadata key hierarchy, and we're excluding Duke specifically. They already lost, they're out of the tournament, doesn't make sense to target impressions toward that. And we have inventory targeting and geo-targeting. We should be all set. So again, we're gonna rename this, deleted that earlier, NCAA exclude Duke. And then we're going to go ahead and submit this.
Just redo it and cut it.
And then we're going to go ahead and submit this. Now, this is basically making a call out. I had a little bit of code wired up so that we would save this to our backend as a new object. I'll be showing you how to do that in just a bit, so sit tight. It looks like it redirected back to this page, so it should be saved. If we now head on over to our App Engine page, the dashboard, we can go to our data store viewer. You'll notice that I have an object called targeting preset, and then we're going to find one called NCAA exclude Duke, which is exactly what we named it, with contents that look eerily similar to our targeting that we just built. So we'll swipe on back, and then I'm going to take a little bit of the magic away from the application. It's relatively simple. We have a handler set up to save the targeting preset. That was what happened when I clicked that submit button. It essentially takes two get args from the URL. It sent over the preset name, which was NCAA exclude Duke, as well as the preset JSON. The targeting that we built was a dictionary, and for all intents and purposes, can be loaded and deserialized into JSON in Python. So we strip out the white space, and then we load it into validated JSON. That was a little bit of a check to make sure that what you're sending over is a valid targeting expression. And then we save that as a targeting preset object, and we dump out the validated JSON into a string, and we redirect the user back to the starting point. The model is equally simple. It's an NDB model, and it has two fields, just the preset name and the JSON. So now that you've saved that data into your database, it's not much good to you unless you have some way of returning it back to a consumer. So one way you might want to do this if you're working with a lot of endpoints and if you have a lot of functionality is if you use Google Cloud endpoints. With Google App Engine, it's super easy. You basically add another pre-configured library into your app YAML file. So that's what we did. You add in another library called endpoints, version 1.0, literally 2 lines in that file. And it will make it a little bit easier to wrap up your application endpoints into an API. It's awesome if you have a ton of endpoints, like I said, because it makes it easier to discover what all those URLs are and what the expected response is. In this case, we specify 2 response objects to return. One is if we want to return a single targeting preset, and we call that targeting string. It's a proto-RPC object, and it's just one simple field. It's just called targeting. And if we want to return all of them, I've made a preset collection, which is a group of messages. So you'll see that we have items, messages, and the message field is of object targeting string, and it can be repeated. So it's also super simple to expose those endpoints. In this case, we've called it something called targeting presets. You can assign a version, you can call it whatever you want in terms of strings. This makes it even easier if you want to version in changes, if you make changes to your application. It's actually really flexible and is a pretty good thing to look into if you're writing your own APIs. And I make a class, and this is our targeting presets API. It's a remote service, and I have 2 endpoints. One is simply on the path for targeting presets, and this will return all of the targeting presets. And the other takes in a named arg called getTargetingPreset. This is what our consumer app is going to be using in a little bit, so you'll get to see this at work. And basically, we have a couple of methods that go through query on DB and package these up so that you can return them. Again, like I mentioned, the application code is going to be uploaded, so if you're curious about any of this, feel free to take a deeper look. So, how do we use those endpoints? It's always good to see this used in practice, so I'll pass the baton back to Chris so he can demonstrate how to use this in a Java application.
Thanks, Nick. So the first thing we're going to do is actually open up the endpoint that Nick created in his application and take a look at what the data he's returning is. So he called the targeting preset that we want to deal with NCAA exclude Duke. And you can see that, if I make this a little bigger for you, it's just a JSON RESTful endpoint, and it returns a single targeting preset object, and with one field that we really care about, which is the targeting. And that is also JSON that has been serialized into a string here. So that's what we're going to be working with and ingesting that into a Java application that uses the DFP client library for Java and connects to DFP and updates our targeting on our developer data line item. So what is that going to look like? We're going to create a class to deserialize the JSON into and call it targeting preset, the same as his endpoint. And the only thing that we really care about is the string targeting string that is in there. And from there, we're going to use the JSON library to deserialize the endpoint on Nick's application into that class object. So to do this, we're going to create our new URL from the endpoint, and we're going to use some other libraries and pull in just that endpoint as a string and read it into this string object. Then we'll create a JSON object. JSON is a library developed by Google for ingesting JSON and turning it into Java objects, plain old Java objects. And it's really easy to use and highly customizable if you have specific rules, but here we don't really need to worry about any of that. We just create a new JSON object and then use that and tell it what class we want to deserialize that preset string into. And now we have our targeting preset object. And from there, we're just going to do the same thing again, since it was sort of nested JSON in the endpoint. We're going to create another new JSON object. And this targeting object we're looking at here is actually the targeting object in the DFP client library for Java. And we're just going to call, again, JSON from JSON. And this time we're going to pass in the class of the DFP targeting object. So that being said, we'll take a look at it running in action in Eclipse. So I'm just going to swing over here. And you'll see I set the endpoint to be Nick's app. And we just need to insert our line item ID and our targeting preset name. If you've worked with our Java client library before, this should look familiar. This is the same format we're using with the run example down here. And here's our private class here for the targeting preset, which is what we're going to be deserializing into. So our targeting preset name, we'll set that again as NCAA exclude Duke. And our line item ID, we're going to take the line item ID that we created earlier and update the targeting on it. So if I go back into DFP, our line item here is our Developer Day, March 2015 line item. So I'll take the ID out of the URL. And you can see, if we look at the targeting now, it's targeting basketball and NCAA and our ad unit for Developer Day. So it does not exclude Duke, and that's what we're going to be doing by using Nick's targeting preset. So let's drop in the line item ID, save, and then take a look at the code. This is just the same code from the slides that I showed you, plus the boilerplate for getting the line item down from DFP with the line item service and our statement builder selecting by ID. So we get our page, we extract a single line item from it with intervals get only element, and then we're going to delegate down to this get targeting preset function. And this is the code that was on the slides. So we get it from the URL, we deserialize into our targeting preset, and then we do another deserializing into our targeting class, which is our DFP targeting object. Once we've updated our targeting, we set it on the line item, and we allow overbook to true in case changing that targeting ended up changing our delivery rate, and we get a warning. We want to say it's okay, we know we'll create it anyway. And we're going to call line item service.update line items. So let's give this a run. All right, so we got our text line item with ID, our ID, and name developer day March 2015 was updated. So all we need to do is swing back over and take a look. I'll refresh the page, and now our targeting should exclude Duke and include the rest of our basketball NCAA. So as it loads, I'll scroll down, and you can see that we have actually updated our targeting. And we see that we're still targeting, this is March Madness basketball, but we are excluding now NCAA Duke. With that, I'll throw it back to Nick.
Well, cool. So we've updated our line item targeting, but it's not really cool unless you can see that take effect. Note that now on our video content, which used to target Duke, we're no longer going to see the relevant Chromebook ad that we set up in the first session because they lost, and Duke fans everywhere grow slightly sadder. So let's see this in practice. So right now we have the video player for the Final Four, and you know, that's absurdly loud, but it's playing that Chromebook ad because March Madness is still going on, and we're not going to finish this. But now that we have a Duke video, we can watch and see that it's not going to actually play this Chromebook ad, but instead you get straight to the highlights of them losing. He's probably going to, okay, I thought he was going to miss that shot. Anyway, so you'll see in practice that now that we've excluded Duke from our custom targeting, it doesn't serve to that line item anymore. And we've done this in a automated way in which you can store a targeting preset for usage later. So in theory, if you wanted to set this up prior to March Madness so you can swap out the targeting on the fly, you could have exposed hundreds of combinations, excluding certain teams, targeting certain teams. The sky's really the limit in that case. So, no questions, comments, or concerns right now, but if you have any questions about creation of video line items, content metadata key hierarchy, custom targeting, or targeting expressions, feel free to leave any updates or comments on our forum. And that's a wrap on how to save targeting expressions in the API.